Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. All right. Well, hello, Murray. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. It's great to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. It's great to be asked. I look forward to our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it'll be a casual chat. There's a lot of history, I think, at play here, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun with things. So believe it or not, and maybe the audience, you will see if they believe it or not. I'm actually going to do less talking. Everyone knows I have the tendency to ramble and talk really, really, really super fast, but I'm actually going to relax, chill out, just kind of go with the flow, chat with you, see how things are going on your end. So I'd like to maybe start off because it is a global audience that will be listening to this. Maybe introduce yourself and maybe start off with how did you get into forestry?
Well, I'm not sure whether an international audience would have ever seen this show, but way back when I was in high school, there was a show on TV called The Forest Rangers. And it was this depiction of these young kids canoeing down lakes and streams and waving at campers. And I thought, that's got to be a good way to make a living. And so that was really why I went into forestry. And when I got into high school, I did one of those tests where they say, what do you want to do for a career? And so I took the test and basically came back that, well, you're not a good candidate for university and you should always stay away from computers. So I thought, well, forestry makes sense then. And so I headed off into a technical college, and that's kind of where it all started.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say, knowing you for many years, that part of that computers are very much part of your life or maybe professional career, especially as you started dabbling with lidar data and whatnot. And we'll get to that in a moment per se. So thinking of that journey, you went to school, you did some training, and I think you was the MNR Ontario Ministry of Natural Resource. Was that the first entry into work and largely carried you through? Tell me more about that.
So I started my career in 1983 with Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and started off in research right out of school, involved with remeasuring permanent sample plots. So going back out and measuring tree by tree over many years, and sort of moved around the province in that capacity. Was put down in the center of our political world in Queen's Park in Ontario, where somehow I was expected to run a field program all through Northern Ontario from downtown Toronto. So that was a little bizarre. And then evolved and moving into Sault Ste. Marie and setting up, working with a team of people to set up a provincial growth and yield program, and then moved across the province into North Bay, looking at still building growth and yield models. And it frustrated me to no end that we could develop really good growth and yield models if we had information about the trees. And every time I sort of looked at my inventory information, I didn't have the level of detail that I really wanted. And so that kind of got me looking at what other technologies might be out there to improve our information on forests so that we could grow them into the future.
Yeah. So thinking back to maybe your younger days, would you have ever imagined, as you worked through your career, that computers, technology would be so integral to your career?
Not a chance, not a
Wow.
chance. I mean, compasses were like state of the art back then. And I remember just even when GPS technology started coming out there and people didn't want to trust them, there's a lot of pushback on just trying to get that into the toolbox of field equipment. And so, no, it's been kind of exciting watching technology slowly make it into a profession that tends to be kind of old school in their approach to field work.
Mhm.
And it's things that people now take for granted, like tablets in the bush and things like that. That was never thought of back then. It was basically pencil and paper.
Yeah. I remember pencil and paper. I do love the tablets in the field, but I can only imagine that back in the day. Not that I'm that old or young or whichever it is, but it's interesting to see the pace of change, I guess, in technology. Even the
Yeah,
time we've known each other,
for
which
sure.
is crazy for sure. So I think on that front, for like our audience per se, I've known you since I was thinking the other night about this as I was stewing the questions I wanted to ask you. But for our listeners, I've known Murray. We've known each other since 2005 or
Yeah.
2000. 6, which
6.
my daughter Kira turned 11 just yesterday, so that kind of gave that pang in the side, and you held Kira when she was a little baby in your house way back, and I just thought, man, where does the time go? But
That's true.
that'll probably be a side discussion, sidebar after this call, maybe in person. But along those lines, I haven't seen you. I think I was trying to think, when was the last time I saw you? And it might have been when we were in Timmins. There was that road trip that we went to, I think Timmins, and was it the
Or
Sioux
Sudbury, we did a
Sudbury?
presentation
That's
with it.
right.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that was the
yeah.
last time.
And that was several years ago. So
It was.
anyhow, you're looking well. So that's awesome to see you're healthy and doing well. So let's maybe go back to that time. So if I remember correctly, I had finished my PhD at Queens. I had moved down to Huntsville, Alabama. I was talking to John Pino the other day, kind of just catching up with people, and I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think that first connection was the Forestry Research Partnership. And again, I think we're going to date ourselves because the FRP was at the Canadian Ecology Center up in Mattawa, which was like awesome place to go and do studies and whatnot. But I think that was the first touch point that the FRP had a call out for some projects. I know from stateside, I was working for McDonald Detweiler and Associates, so there was that Canadian footprint, and I was working for a lidar mapping company, and we had applied, not necessarily thinking we would succeed because the address was in Huntsville, Alabama, of all places. But I know you and a consortium applied as well, and your team was successful. And I think I remember, if I remember that far, I'd come back and I'd reached out on a whim and said, "Hey, it's like, what do you know about lidar? It's like, you want to chat and whatnot." And I think was that the first, we connected somewhere, the start of
That
many
was
napkins. But was that the
that was
start?
that was it, and that was it. And forever grateful for that, reaching out to myself, and it was John Pino, and we had this work to do now, and it was like, what's next? And out of your goodness, you sat down and we had pie at a
Yes.
restaurant in Mattawa, and we
I remember
talked
that.
about it, and you basically said, okay guys, here's sort of the way you got to go through this whole process. And so that sort of got us on our journey, that got Ontario on his journey, that got a lot of places in Canada on his journey, as they
Yeah.
watched what we were doing there. So
Yeah.
thank you very much to you.
Well, I know I have to thank you as well. Like you've taken the needle super far, much further, in government and even work you're doing now. So I think it was one of those mutually beneficial meetings of the minds and whatnot. So as I think back to that, some of my fondest memories thinking of lidar, and we were getting into it. This is 2006, I think, with Tembec, Romeo Millet Forest. This was what, half a point per square meter, whatever that means. And we were
Yep.
like, oh, this is big data. How are we going to handle it? I think if you remember, we had those cool Lassie rugged drives that were all the rage. They're orange
Yep.
and what, like 128 gigs or something like that. And we were like, wow, this is like awesome. Although times have changed now. Thinking of that journey, what are some of the things, I guess, as you started that journey, kind of surprised you in terms of just getting into this new technology, relatively new? What were some of those things in hindsight as you look back that if you could tell yourself back then, it's like, watch out for this or think about that? Are there any things that popped to mind as you started that journey? Because that's, almost, 2006 to now, like that's, many
Yeah,
moons per se.
for sure. Data storage, data handling, and also the fact that people don't recognize, or because of if they're starting at lidar now, there's a whole host of tools out there that one can go to, between open source to commercial packages. Most of our spatial platforms now could handle lidar data, but back in
Right.
2006, there wasn't anything. In fact, we did everything in our shop basically in a DBF format. We took it out of sort of a spatial world and just dealt with it as straight files, and then put them back in at the end, and slowly, methodically went through and sort of built all the products. What I did over months before, I can literally do in hours now. And so,
Yeah.
that in the file storage, I mean, up until recently, we were still shipping hard drives around. And, yeah, they're bigger hard drives, but there's still a time and a cost of just even
Right.
uploading the data. And so now, we're looking at other ways of processing that and sharing the results much quicker. And that's exciting.
Yeah, and I remember during that time, by then, from a career point of view, I guess you were in North Bay by then. out on the office in Trout Lake. I remember downstairs, Dave
Yep.
Nesbitt was one inside.
Yep.
You
For
had
sure.
your corner office there with a lot of gear floating around per se. So I guess thinking of that journey, you've done fantastic work. As I said, starting in Romeo with the Tembec side, now where I am, I guess now Greenlink per se, and you've obviously worked on different sites in Hearst and provided leadership on that front. Uh, Thinking of a couple things. So I'm going to ask just because we know each other well, and I'm going to irritate you per se. So let's talk about age. I remember many moons ago, Murray Woods would be on the stage and like, oh, forget about age, people. It's like ain't ever going to happen. What's the science telling us today about lidar and age? What are your thoughts on that? Has there been a change in thinking or new research direction? What are you thinking on that front?
Well, we've done some work at actually trying to predict age, and I guess it comes back to, for ABA, an area-based approach to lidar inventories, to produce estimates of volume in BA and whatever, we don't need age.
Right.
However, usually it's the systems following the inventory that require age, sort of a planning system. And so everybody still wants age. So we're still leaning on photo interpretation generally, or time since disturbance mapping, to sort of provide us that age into our planning cycle, combined and fused with the LiDAR inventory. But we've been dabbling around looking at predicting age, and there's been some work in Quebec, there's been work here in Ontario where our root mean square are probably plus or minus 10 years.
Wow.
So it's possible, but it's sort of not directly predicting. It's sort of in relation to other things. And so
So
I
does
still
that mean
don't
I
feel
could
like
prepare a new T-shirt now that says like I'm converted maybe on the back or something with age?
maybe I have
Maybe.
another one that says lidar never lies.
There you
That's
go.
mine.
There
And
you
I've sent
go.
many a field crew out to remeasure their heights because I could tell how badly they were done.
Yeah, absolutely. So walk me through some of your experiences on that front, because we talked about area-based approach for our listeners. We also have individual tree inventories, ITC or ITD or whatever jargon we want to go with. What's the state of the art today in terms of your view? Because we know each other well. I know you well. You're a humble guy. You're not you're not the one to beat your chest. So I'm going to do that for you. You are a leader in the thinking space here around how you apply lidar technology, photogrammetric technology to lidar inventory. So on the ABA side, maybe we'll start there. How do you see the landscape? What's the state of the art today?
I think it's evolving. I think we know how to do the basic stuff very well in terms of making direct predictions for a 20 by 20 meter space or whatever. I think we're learning that one forest type in Ontario is equal to another one. Example would be a boreal forest, sort of a single story situation, and ABA has a direct application. But as we move into systems where we do partial harvesting, um, like shelterwood harvesting in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, where we're going in every 20 years and we're removing parts of the stand and developing regeneration, we end up with this multi-tier structure. And we need to be able to split our inventory estimates by layer to be useful to the manager, because they can decide what layer they're going to manage. So they want to know what the inventory is for that layer, not including the understory. And so that's where a lot of our current research now, and we're trying to not remove photo interpretations from structure calls, but allow the LiDAR to provide a much more objective prediction measurement of that structure that we can then use to tease out what those layer predictions are. So that's kind of a lot of our research right now, is looking at that with some pretty dense LiDAR to do that, not sort of that half point stuff that we started off in 2006 on the Romeo for sure. We're dealing with single photon LiDAR now, seeing how that can be useful. And, we're dealing with 30 to 40 points per square meter. However, we realize that we're not getting the lower understory as well as we can with terrestrial mobile LiDAR systems. So we're looking at maybe fusing some of that stuff together to see what we're missing. But for sure, I think the nuts and bolts were laid out well by you in your PhD work, and we've just been basically expanding that application and just seeing where it holds and where it may fall apart,
Right.
and try to refine how we're going to improve that going forward.
Yeah, so definitely I'd like to chat more about the SPL in a moment, but I guess thinking of again, I finished the PhD in 2006, but roughly when we met was that time frame. So very much a lot of my own thinking in a commercial centric view, if you will, was shaped by our working relationship. And for the listeners, like Murray and I were notorious. We'd go for dinner and then take every napkin available, and we'd leave with like napkins with like all sorts of diagrams, and ideas. And the beauty of the relationship, I think, is we both had the capacity and capability to execute on some of those ideas and really move the yardstick forward per se. But on one of those points, I'm curious because with a lot of listeners, they probably dabble with airborne lidar right now, and some maybe in Latin America, there and other jurisdictions, a lot of UAV lidar running per se. But there's always been this idea of, do you put a 2-meter threshold or not on the point clouds for ABA? It came from Scandinavia. A lot of the publications of Nielsen, Holmgren, the Scandinavian contingent, NACIT, and whatnot. There's always a 2-meter threshold. We've always had this debate. Well, I should say we had a debate. We always had this thesis of there's value in that 2-meter to 0-meter in terms of describing what that structure is. Where's the current thinking on that nowadays in terms of ABA from a methods point of view? Do you hard threshold or do you keep it?
I think generally the theory is they still threshold. Now, I continue to do both. I continue to threshold and continue to go down to 0 and then compare and say, I don't gain anything from thresholding. And where I see the gain actually is in those partial harvesting systems, where we're trying to deal with understanding the distribution of the stems within the plot. LiDAR and volume prediction, for example, is height driven. LiDAR measures height, height's volume. So there's still challenges in LiDAR when you have a 38-meter tall white pine stand that's been partially harvested, and you have gaps between those trees, but you still have a high height, and so it still wants to estimate high volumes, but you remove part of that volume. And so we struggle with trying to get the LiDAR to understand the right combination of predictors to deal with that space between the stems. And so what we found is that including those low values, including even ground returns in some case, we can actually get a little bit better prediction, but it's still a work in progress for that.
Right, absolutely. And I think thinking of the work you've done, Roy Millet Forest, Hers, Petawawa, a lot of great scientific papers. I think one of your papers was maybe the first, operational lidar inventory published. It's I can remember, I don't know if it's figure 6, with all the predictions and stuff like that. That was a really important piece of work. Thinking of the forestry companies that are listening to this right now, maybe looking to embark on lidar inventories. Sometimes maybe there's a disconnect between like forest industry seeking from what a forest inventory means to what an academic or researcher. But what would you impart to like a practitioner looking to do an ABA? What are those key things that yes, the Canadian Forest Service, Dr. Joanne White has published on, best practices. I think there's a iteration 2 by now. Maybe there's a 3 per se, and some guidelines there. But I think we've talked about in the past that there's a science and an art as well. So thinking about those practitioners and all the ABAs you've done, what are maybe the top 3 things you'd say to a practitioner? Say, you know what, you really need to think about this, and maybe, for instance, back in our day, your field of view is too narrow or wide, or how much overlap do you have between the flight lines? That level of detail, I might argue, are not as material anymore. But what would maybe be 3 top points you'd impart?
Well, I think that's a good one. One of the challenges I had is people would come to me, a company would come to me, or counties or something, and say, we want a LiDAR inventory. What are my LiDAR specs that I need to collect? And I kind of go, we just basically use whatever LiDAR was provided, and we always got good results. And so to me, there's a message there. And so, yes, when you read the papers about scan angles, whether you want to, not use any pulses that have angles that are high, we've tended to use them all, and we still have got very good results. And I think everybody has to remember that you need to compare the results you're getting from a lidar ABA to what you had before, if you knew how good even before was. Now the fact we can put some numbers around how well the predictions are working, which I think is really key. But it's also a bit of a slap in the face, because people say, what do you mean you're predicting BA plus or minus 5 square meters at a 20 by 20 meter pixel? That doesn't sound very good. And I can say, well, what do you have now? Well, what's your stand estimate like?
Right.
How good is that? And people go, well, they can't answer it because they haven't got a clue. And I'm probably jumping ahead here, but one of the things we always have to remember when we're predicting pixels, there's an error associated with that, but nobody manages a pixel. People manage an aggregate of pixels. And so once you have a look at expressing your prediction over 30, 40, 50, 100 pixels, a stand, if that's what you want to call it, then your error goes way down. And we've demonstrated that to people. So I'm really excited about what ABA offers. Um, I think, getting back to your question, one of the challenges, again, with people who are interested in ABAs, is sometimes they're not willing to invest the time in the GPS part of the project.
Right.
And so they say, we have field plots, can't you use those? And I said, well, how good is the spatial positioning of that plot? And they said, well, I used a recreational grade GPS. I don't want to name any of them out there. And I said, well, you know what? If it's in an even age plantation and that error is plus or minus 30 meters, it may not matter. But
Right.
if you're into a diverse vertical structure situation, that plot positioning has to be really good in order to maximize the value you're going to get for the LiDAR dollars you're spending. And so
Right.
that was probably my number one thing to try to help people understand.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So, as we do, we've a lot of folks don't know on our side, we're up in the 40, 50 million hectare range of these area based inventories. We see the same thing, no matter how you reinforce that protocol, sampling protocol, on that plot center, that positioning. Inevitably, someone pulls out I will not name it either, but a black device that everyone had, a forester had, hung on their vest type of thing, that they thought that was high precision, and it's created some problems because of the precision of the lidar data. Absolutely. So thinking on that front, from a practitioner's point of view, they're probably listening and saying, okay, I've got some plots, and maybe not all of them are useful. I'm assuming, still fixed area plots. We're talking about 20-meter pixels. Some think 25. What's your expert recommendation of those folks listening now on 20, 25 pixel? What does that mean on plot size? Is there a general rule of thumb, or is it really variable by forest type and conditions?
I think they should be variable by forest type a bit, but I think speaking from an agency point of view, you probably want it to be consistent across your area. I'm talking about a province or a state type of thing. Typically, a 20 by 20 meter pixel is going to be adequate, especially for boreal forest conditions. To talk internationally, once you start getting into big trees, large crowns, then a 20 by 20 meter plot size becomes small. When you think about how many trees
Right.
physically can fit in a 20 by 20 meter area. So we're talking 11.28 meter radius. And so you get a big 35, 40 meter white pine tree with a big crown. Sometimes you only may have one tree in the plot. And so what you're measuring on the ground becomes less use.
Right.
However, we haven't seen a great deal of difference in the results, to be honest, so
Right.
far. So
Right.
it may be my old growth and yield worries about sampling enough trees on our ground plots that sort of is haunting me about that one.
Right. Well, that highlights your background, right? As a forester, being in that space, your FES work. Like, a lot of people don't realize there's all sorts of other aspects of Murray Woods in terms of expertise. It's not just on the lidar inventory side. So what I'm hearing really is fixed area plots, circular. You still just need to do the plot center. Don't do the four corners, because then the
Oh,
GNSS might throw you
please,
off.
please.
Yeah.
I've had people with hexagon shaped plots. I've had trapezoids. And one thing you can do with GPS, a square plot, you'll end up with a trapezoid.
Right.
There's just no, go circular. It just makes life a lot easier for everybody.
Right, absolutely. So bigger trees, basically, you might need a slightly larger
That's
circular
right.
plot, but yeah, great. And people can reach out to you for more information on that front. So let's maybe shift gears. I feel like this might generate some debate or discussion.
Mm.
ITC. Again, for our listeners, Murray's got a rich history going back to Francois Goujon, Don Leckie, and some work there, testing it on imagery and lidar and whatnot. On the limb geomatic side, we've been involved with challenges on that front. We've developed our own technology and there's a host of other people there. Again, we go back far enough, we can think of stateside companies that have come and gone that have possibly negatively impacted forestry companies, consulting companies in Canada as a function of that. But where do you sit today on ITC? Is it ready to go for people, or is it still it depends?
It's interesting. I think it depends on where you're coming from. Coming from the research world, whenever I see somebody present ITC results, I keep waiting for the slide that shows here's how well we did in the validation, and I very rarely see that. So I'm not saying that their results aren't good. My thoughts on ITC are that if you are doing individual trees, whether it be imagery or near infrared LiDAR right now, if you're looking at segmenting individual trees in an urban situation along a parking lot, you can get a good segmentation of those crowns. And once you have a good segmentation of those crowns, you can use the structure returns from the LiDAR, the intensity from the near infrared, or the image sort of spectral signatures to help you do a really good job at predicting individual species or close to a species group, like a larger species group like tolerant hardwood versus intolerant hardwoods. The reality in a forest situation is if you can't segment the trees well, then you start getting overlap. And that's kind of where I see it falling apart, is that, you know, once you have especially hardwood trees intermingling, then it becomes very difficult for any algorithm to try to split those exactly. And that's where I see the biggest issue with ITC falling apart. Do I want it to work? Yes, of course I want it to work. And maybe if we'd be happier with broader species types, like, you know, for us tolerant hardwoods, you know, jack pine, black spruce, plantations for each one of those. If people were willing to work at that level, I think we may have a product, but I don't think we're to the point where we can split out individual trees. I want somebody to prove me wrong.
Right. Well, I often say it's still the holy grail. It works under certain conditions, and then other times it doesn't. And I share your I'll call it frustration, where often there's we used to call them dog and pony shows in our early day. And it's not to say everyone does that, but the pretty pictures. But you're right. It's the meat and potatoes is in that table that is ugly and boring to see, but it really compares what was on the ground with what you said you pulled out of the data, whatever that is. And often that is missing. And sometimes it is included, and then we feel deflated because the numbers may not be good, or maybe as good, right? Like it's not 96. And to your point, well, you're comparing it to what? You know, is 70% good enough when you got nothing? It's like, I don't know, I might take that per se. So thinking of that, you know, a lot of things we're seeing. So on my side, I'm obviously thinking about the future. I always have. I think today a lot of people recognize what's happening in the landscape. Didn't understand maybe what I was thinking about a decade ago, do now. I'm now thinking another decade out. I was curious to see, what are you seeing in trends? Like, because you were early with now SLAM, everyone's got their SLAM device, whether on a UAV or in the field type of thing. You're doing that in Petawawa years ago, testing different technologies. A lot of people are doing mobile backpack, you know, a lot of hover map stuff, and all great technologies. But do you think we're closer to that digital twinning of that forest, recognizing we got ABA that'll get us some estimates, the ITC will get us close, depending how you skin the cat per se. There's value in both. Your thesis is it's not one or the other. Photogrammetry, lidar, ITC, ABA, you know, put them all together to achieve that outcome. But are you seeing certain trends in terms of what the future might look like for a digital forester in the toolkit that they might have by default?
Well, I think the backpack type mobile scanning that you talked about whether it's backpack, you're carrying it around like we did with some of our early work. And I know there's some new ones on the market now. I'm a little bit out of touch with where that technology is right now. The potential is great. There's all kinds of things to still be worked out by bright students. Um, One would be species, one would be live or dead. I mean, you scan a tree live or dead, it kind of looks the same in a point cloud.
Right.
And so I see them very useful for regeneration surveys. However, in our comparisons of looking at whether we measure BA equally well with a mobile scanner versus what we measure on the plots, we have great one-to-one correlation. It's possible to do, but we had to add in the dead trees to the live trees because again, you couldn't decipher that. There's still lots of room for the algorithms that process terrestrial or mobile lidar, individual tree detection stuff. Some of the same issues from the airborne, but a little bit different level. You're trying to clean up noise, which is usually, for us, balsam fir or something growing around the larger stem at DBH, and trying to recover DBH for the tree when it's covered on 2 sides, 4 sides by regeneration. Some of those issues still have to be thought through how we're going to do that. And I think you're right. It's the fusing of the technologies is where the future is going to be, because with airborne, we'll never get as good a picture. Now, maybe UAVs are coming closer, but even with single photon lidar, really dense near infrared SPL lidar, we're never going to get the type of information at the ground layer we're going to get by walking through the forest. And so if we could fuse that even in a sampling approach, basically have our calibration plots, scan the calibration plots, measure the trees normally as we always did, and then fuse that point cloud together and maybe express that over the landscape, we can maybe add all kinds of extra value. Things that we've never been able to do with an ABA approach, like stem form. We
Right.
produce volume estimates, like every single tree is a perfect straight tree, just right out of the textbook. But anybody who has been in the bush walking around knows that every tree can be different from others, especially in hardwoods. Where do they fork? Where do they branch? Where's that
Right.
merchantable length? And so our volumes could be much more refined that way
Right, right.
going
Well,
forward.
you said a keyword there, and probably a good time to segue, because I think a lot of people who may be listening and know us are probably wanting to hear the lidar experts' views on SPL right now. So maybe introduce us to what it is at a high level. You're always great at explaining complex ideas in simpler Forester terms, and so walk us through maybe what SPL is, why you're excited about it, and maybe what the early potential you're seeing with it is.
Well, I'm definitely not a single photon lidar expert in any means, but the basics are it's a sensor that we can fly at higher altitudes in faster aircraft with a wider swath width, which results in lower cost. And let's face it, lidar acquisition is about cost in many cases. It always comes down to, how much does it cost me per hectare? How many times, Kevin, have you been asked that question?
It's the first
And
question.
yeah, and so single photon is attractive from that point of view, but it's a different beast. Instead of near infrared, we're playing with a green band. We also have a pulse of lidar data that's emitted from the sensor. It goes through a filter that basically splits that into 100 beamlets. So each pulse is now split into 100, which allows us much higher densities at the top of the canopy level, but they also have a lot less energy because they've been split from that original source of that one pulse. And so one of the questions we had with single photon is how well we're going to be able to penetrate through different forest canopies to reach the forest floor. And so that was definitely one of our concerns early on with single photon lidar. And we did a pilot study in Petawawa, having a look at that, and we've done a lot of follow-up stuff. There's papers published on it now that talk about how well we did under certain forest conditions with the single photon lidar. And we don't need to get one return every square meter on the
Right.
ground to basically do what we want to do, which is sort of normalize that lidar return from a Z value to a height value of a tree. And the specs were met by single photon lidar in the Petawawa Research Forest. However, we do see areas where with really heavy overstory and heavy understory, we have some big gaps where there's no returns. Where with the near infrared, a few years later, so the stands was a little bit different. We were getting some returns from traditional linear mode lidar systems. Did it impact the results? No. Um,
Okay.
but there's still people, a lot of people kind of asking where SPL fits in terms of typical like floodplain mapping, and leaf on conditions. Leaf off conditions is not going to be an issue, of course. So I don't know. From the forestry point of view, right now, looks like we're good. At least in the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence, we're just rolling out in the boreal now. Again, having a look there and see how things are going.
Right. And the province of Ontario's kind of put all their eggs in one basket. They're flying SPL across the Greenland base there. And I know a lot of
Yep.
licensees are excited and hoping for experts like yourself to kind of come in and help and translate that big data for large volume data into something that is meaningful to them. So it's great to hear the SPLs there. I know there's always been Geiger mode as well. There's been other types of, if we call them more advanced or maybe just different flavors of technology. But you're absolutely right. When I talk with people, it's a whole new vocabulary. Like, are we talking linear mode? Are we talking about SPL and the point densities? I think you said SPL yours was about 40 squares,
Yeah, I've
40
seen
points per
numbers.
square meter.
Depends on where you I say between 30 and 40 generally.
Right. And there's linear mode sensors now that can, on one pass get up to 100, 120 points per square meter. So we may be at the age where there's multiple different types of technology that for the average forester, it's probably going to come back down to, as you said, cost. If they all roughly get me the same thing, is it just a cost, a unit economics decision at that point? So we'll see on that particular front. So I know, yeah, for people who don't know, like you are, I'm going to say technically retired, even though I'm not sure what that means, but you've definitely retired from the provincial government, passed the torch there, doing other cool stuff. Maybe share with the listeners what are some of the other things. I believe you're doing your work under the Treedimensions banner, consulting work, still collaborating with Dr. Penner, Dr. Pitt, hosts of people, Margaret and Doug. It's again small community here from a different era. But maybe tell the listeners what's on your plate. What are you having fun with nowadays? Now that you're more free, if we want to call it that.
Well, it's exciting times, and yeah, and I didn't raise this point early enough, and I should have talked about our collaboration early on. But really, any work that I've been involved with has always been a team. It's never been me. And I'm glad you mentioned Margaret and Doug, Joanne White, super people, Dave Nesbitt. Sort of all made this stuff happen. So we've all benefited from that. I think the forest community has benefited from a lot of this work. Yeah, I'm retired, but I really can't give up on this stuff. And you mentioned Ontario's just embarked in SPL, and you and I were sort of talking lidar since 2005, and Ontario has now moved forward over the last since 2018 was when they started flying SPL. And so they now have a full inventory program that puts out calibration plots. We didn't talk about that, but some of the other work we demonstrated that instead of going out and trying to find jack pine that's 30 meters tall, jack pine that's 10 meters tall, different sort of structure to put plots on, we actually let the lidar tell us where to put the plots. We don't care about species, we care about lidar structure because that's what we're actually modeling. And so Ontario's embarked on that, and they've flown probably I won 6 forest management license areas right now. And so I'm involved with them on a project to help process that data. Again, trying to change the paradigm from you and I, having, I can remember CDs. We're now doing it on the cloud. And basically from step A to Z over very quick times and getting those results in people's hands.
Yeah.
And that's to me the huge advantage of lidar. And it just frustrates me if we're going to fly lidar in 2018 and put plots in 2019, then I expect by the end of 2019 you're going to have the product,
Right.
not 5 years later, or 10 years later, which is typical sometimes in a traditional forest inventory sense.
Yeah.
So we talked earlier about the fact that ABA is kind of it is operational, but there's always ways to improve it. And some of the things we talked about, that structure prediction. trying to understand how to automate the structure prediction at a pixel level, and then how to aggregate that structure prediction at a pixel level to a management area, whether it's a stand or whatever, a harvest block. How do you deal with that in terms of assigning a vertical structure? And then how do you allocate the predictions by layer so that, and as a person who's processing LiDAR data, I'm not going to say this is the management layer. That's somebody else's decision to make. All I want to do is provide them. Here's the volume in BA at those layers. You decide what you're going to do. And also, I didn't say here's the volume layer by species. I still can't do species with the LiDAR. We're still leveraging photo interpretation species. But I think, talked about the future. The future to me is satellite with the different seasons that you can get good satellite imagery now. There's all kinds of other ways that we can add species along that time series to allow us to add that extra value to a LiDAR derived inventory. Again,
Yeah.
we may have to coarsen. We're not talking individual tree species. We may be talking forest units or forest groups of species, but I still think that's going to be very enlightening. And
Yeah.
the other project, just to quickly wrap up, that we're involved with is site productivity. We talked about age before. Trying to get away from using kind of to typical site index per se. Can we look at mapping height growth? And
Mhm.
so we have the advantage here in Ontario of having multiple LiDAR acquisitions over time. So on the Romeo that we all started with, we have 2005, 2006. We have a 2018 LiDAR acquisition. And in the middle, I have DAP or pixel matching or SGR of image point cloud. And again, another opportunity of leveraging a LiDAR derived DTM with an image point cloud in the interim. Can we actually look at documenting growth? And therefore I can have growth rate by pixel. And can I use that to advance stands over time? And so that's kind of our thrust in the short term.
Yeah, I often, when I meet young people, I often say, the yous are the world that you should listen to this because that's where the research is going, the true research versus we've seen over the years, the usual empirical thing, it's been done and whatnot. And really these things you described, I think are perfect tidbits, gems in terms of people, younger people maybe looking at doing graduate school or doing research from that point of view. It's a
Always
fascinating
am
topic.
always amazed. We were involved with an NSERC project called Aware, and the caliber of students and their work was just phenomenal.
Right. Right.
Lot of fantastic, from the UAV front to image point clouds to using 3D photos in the forest, right through species prediction with LiDAR. Just a long list, a lot of great master's and PhD work came out of that.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Hey, we could talk forever. I'm sure our listeners are sensing. We can go sideways, backwards, forwards, up, down, circular. There's a host of technologies out there. I agree that spaceborne component. When we look at even the venture back side of things, there's a whole nother community. I think there is a satellite with a wood component that went up into orbit just not too long ago. So I agree. We're going to see a bigger push on that front. It's great to see you're leveraging that expertise to the province, because I know since the get-go, anytime you deal with a government engine, there's other things afoot that people may always complain, oh, it's too slow, why can't they do this? But there are other factors and things afoot as a function of being government that like it or not, you got to kind of stick handle and navigate through. So great to hear on the expertise side that you'll be providing or have been providing them that expertise. So thinking as we wind down, as I said, we could chat forever. It's been a while since we connected, but thinking back, again, you're still a young guy, right? Like you started working pretty early. So as much as we say, you're retired, it's like you're still a young guy by all standards with still a lot of great things to do. For our audience, there's jokes, when we used to see each other, you'd be like, oh, Dr. Lim. And I'd be like, Dr. Woods. And often when I say that, I say it in the most respectful way, because, in the past we've talked about, you're like, I've done the school, there's other people who've gone for graduate degrees. And for me, the passion you bring to the research, the curiosity, it's infectious. And in all honesty, that's some of my fondest memories when I've worked with you, is just go. It's like, well, what about this? Yeah, let's do that. What about this? And just going forward. So that's truthfully something I miss as Lim Geo's kind of grown and evolved to what it is. And you're in the research world. At some point, there was a natural bifurcation that was going to happen just as a function of where we are. But thinking of some of your highlights, we've traveled internationally and whatnot. What would maybe be, one or two highlights when you look back to your lidar journey there? Obviously there's so much we haven't covered on this podcast, but what are some of those highlights that you think back to that really kind of give you that little twinge in the gut in terms of, yeah, that was a good time, I miss it, and whatnot? Is there anything that kind of pops to mind?
Seeing you in the bush, that was always a good thing. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I enjoyed going to conferences. I enjoyed listening to students. It 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 rattled me a little bit sometimes when there was the disconnect from the academic world versus sort of the operational reality and where I wanted things to get to. I think probably looking back, the best part of this whole journey has been the teamwork. And I don't provide a lot, maybe passion, thank you. But I think it's being able to pull people together to work on a common project. And those who may not know Kevin well, I have on my wall here, based on my enthusiasm or passion, it says out of scope. I got that from Kevin many times in email. I said we would do this, and you want to do that. Out of scope.
There was never a shortage of ideas for me, my friend. It was like a machine that just kept cranking things going forward and whatnot. But yeah, no, it's fun memories all around. And as I said, again, you're being humble in terms of your contribution. I think in one of our earlier conversations, we're of a generation that I don't want to say people have forgotten, but maybe there's always someone before you, just as they were before us. And there's lessons to be learned, and I think with your continued contribution, it'll keep us on the course of not repeating and doing that circle of like, oh, did we do this, versus kind of moving it forward. I love the idea of hybrid, but as I said, knowing you long enough for our listeners, this is a guy who knows his stuff above and beyond, and definitely encourage people to reach out to talk about anything, because as I said, you've done terrestrial, mobile, you have done airborne, you've done DAP, SGM, whatever. There's a wealth of knowledge there. So one last question, more on the fun side, since we were talking about UAV and whatnot. Lots of news lately about UFOs and footages. Do you believe in UFOs, or do you think they're just UAVs with next generation lidar strapped onto that thing? What do you think?
I feel like I'm not keeping up with the news. I haven't really followed that there's been an abundance. I have no problem if there is or there is. I don't know.
Yeah, you'd be too busy with your data room, probably in the room next door at your house, processing data per se. So, so Murray, for people who want to reach out to you, share your details: Twitter, website, LinkedIn, email, what website address? What's the best way they can get in touch with you?
I'm not that sophisticated. I'm still a guy that likes to go to the bush. It's just basically woods.murray@gmail.com.
There you go.
Reach me.
There you go, everybody. So if you need to get a hold of Dr. Murray Woods, as I call him, feel free to reach out on email from him. So my friend, thanks very much for joining the Digital Forester podcast. I hope you had fun. I had a lot of time listening to you and just reminiscing. I hope the audience will hear some of these stories and maybe, put a couple things together. And if they have questions, reach out to you or myself. In terms of people will learn, you and I both love to chat. So sometimes we chat too much per se, but that's a good thing. But in any event, thanks very much, my friend, for joining on. Wishing you the best in your retirement, and looking forward to seeing all the cool things you're going to do.
Just wish we'd kept those napkins.
That's right. I agree. All right. Thanks, Murray. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Kevin.